Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is always to take a monumental topic, crack open the source material, and really pull out those surprising facts that just make you feel instantly well-informed.
And today, we are definitely tackling a monumental one.
We're strapping in for a long, fascinating ride through the origins of Rome, and our guide is the man who literally wrote the book on it, Titus Livius, or as most of us know him, Livy.
And that's really the perfect place to start, because we're talking about the ultimate historical epic. This is the history that shaped how Rome saw its own glory, from, the famous myth of Romulus and Remus with the wolf,
Right, the founding myth itself.
all the way up to the age of the emperors, specifically the reign of Augustus.
So we're not just, analyzing an old book today. This deep dive is about the man himself, the political pressures, the personal biases, and even the dramatic search for his lost work. Because Livy wasn't just some scribe sitting in the forum. He was a provincial, a philosophical writer, and he was living through absolute chaos. He designed his huge work, Urbe Condita, with a very specific moral purpose in mind.
Precisely. Urbe Condita from the founding of the city is just an astonishing piece of work. The scale is immense. It's one of the most complete narratives we have, even if it is, let's say, dramatically embellished at times.
I think that's a fair description.
But to really get it, you have to understand the man's contradictions.
Yeah.
Titus Livius, this fiercely proud man from Patavium, who becomes the official storyteller for the very emperor who ended the republic he so admired.
And that tension is the thread we're going to be pulling on today. Okay, let's unpack that provincial identity because it's so key. For the man who became the defining historian of Rome, he was fundamentally an outsider.
He really was. He was born Titus Livius in Patavium, which is modern Padua in northern Italy, probably around 59 BC.
And we need to spend a minute on Patavium because this wasn't just some sleepy little town on the frontier.
Oh, not at all. You have to understand, at the time Livy was born, it was a major economic powerhouse. Our sources are clear on this. It was the second wealthiest city on the entire Italian peninsula.
Second only to Rome itself.
Second only to Rome. So it had influence, it had a huge amount of resources, and a very wealthy, established upper class.
So Livy wasn't born into poverty, but he was born a long way from the center of power. And Patavium was the largest city in Cisalpine Gaul, right?
Yes, and the status of that whole region was changing dramatically right when he was growing up. During his lifetime, it was formally merged into Italy proper. And crucially, its inhabitants, its wealthy inhabitants, were given full Roman citizenship.
A change brought in by Julius Caesar, mostly.
Mostly by Caesar, yeah. And this created this sort of unique identity. You're a full Roman citizen, but you still have this fierce loyalty to your region and a very distinct set of values.
And the sources are so clear that Livy never, ever let go of that. He was always proud of Patavium. So what were those values? What made Patavium so distinct?
The city was famous for its conservative values, both in morality and in politics. Think of it as a contrast to the perceived corruption and complexity of Rome during the late Republic.
Right.
Patavium was known for this sort of sturdy, almost old-fashioned republican virtue. Things like frugality, duty, political independence.
And that morality, that focus on integrity, that becomes the foundation for the virtues he writes about in his history, doesn't it?
It's the absolute foundation. He's basically projecting the ideals of his hometown onto Rome's heroic past.
And those ideals were put to the test when he was young. His teenage years, the 40s BC, that was the height of the Roman civil wars. It must have been chaos.
Total chaos. And it prevented him from getting that traditional Roman education.
What do you mean?
Well, there's this amazing story involving a man named Asinius Pollio. He is the governor of Cisalpine Gaul, and he was aligned with Mark Antony.
Okay.
So Pollio tries to lean on Patavium's immense wealth to fund Antony's war effort against the Senate.
He's trying to get this rich, conservative city to back a faction that many saw as, well, autocratic.
Exactly. And Patavium resisted. But it's how they resisted that's so interesting.
It wasn't an open revolt?
No, it was this quiet, powerful defiance. The wealthy citizens just refused to contribute the money and weapons. They didn't fight. They just went into hiding.
Making it impossible for Pollio to collect.
Right. And Pollio gets so frustrated that he does something incredibly desperate. He tries to bribe their slaves to reveal where their masters are hiding.
Wow. Turning slaves against masters, that's a massive social taboo, especially in a conservative place like that.
A huge gamble. And it failed completely. The city's social structure held. Instead of betraying their masters, the citizens who were in hiding, they rallied and formally pledged their allegiance to the Senate.
The anti-Antony faction.
Yeah, anti-Antony faction.
Okay.
So right there in his formative years, Livy sees his hometown actively choose the side of the old republic over this emerging imperial power.
That has to leave a mark, watching your city stand its ground like that. And you mentioned the Civil Wars probably disrupted his education.
For sure, he would have missed out on that standard higher education in Rome or the tour of Greece that was so common for a young man of his class.
So he was educated, obviously, but not in that traditional mold.
He's clearly educated in philosophy and rhetoric. You can see it in his writing, but that finishing school experience was likely derailed by the war. And this all leads to a very specific personal slight that followed him for years.
The Patavinity comment.
The Patavinity slight, yes, from the very same Asinius Pollio years later.
The governor who was snubbed by the city?
The very same. He derisively commented on Livy's Latin, calling it Patavinity, suggesting it was full of, provincialisms that sophisticated Romans would look down on.
But was it really about his grammar, or was this just a political jab?
I think the consensus is that it was almost entirely political. It was Pollio's bad feelings about Patavium's refusal to help him all those years ago. It wasn't a critique of syntax. It was a way of saying, you may be a famous historian in Rome now, but you're still just a boy from that stubborn town up north.
A constant reminder of his outsider status.
Always.
And yet he moves to Rome in the 30s BC, and he does become established. But here's another key detail. He never held public office.
No, never a senator, never served in the army. And that's crucial.
Why?
Because it gave him a kind of freedom that was rare for Roman historians. He had his own money, likely inherited from his wealthy family. He didn't need a political appointment or a patron to survive.
He was an independent scholar.
Completely.
Yeah.
Which allowed him to spend decades of his life just writing this one massive work.
But that independence maybe had a downside, at least in terms of historical detail, like his military knowledge.
That's a great point. Scholars have pointed out that his accounts of battles sometimes contain, elementary mistakes, errors in deployment or topography.
He was a scholar, not a soldier.
Exactly. This focus was on the moral courage, the heroism, not the gritty logistics of the battlefield.
And just to round out his personal story, he was married, had a family, and eventually he went home.
Yes, a very traditional Roman family life. He had at least one daughter who married a rhetorician and a son who wrote a book on geography. And then, after all those years in Rome, writing its history, he died back in his home city of Patavium in AD 17.
The provincial patriot, right to the end.
Which brings us to the great work itself.
Yes, Ab Urbe Condita, from the founding of the city, Livy's only surviving work. And it's just hard to overstate the scope of this thing.
It's a leviathan. I mean, we're talking about a history that starts with the earliest legends, before the traditional 753 BC founding date, and it goes all the way up to the death of Emperor Augustus in AD 14.
It was originally 142 books, right?
142. And tragically, only 35 survive in their entirety today.
It's a devastating loss. But what we do have gives us our main account of some critical periods, especially the Second Punic War. His version of Hannibal's campaigns is just foundational.
It is. But what's really crucial to understand is that Livy had a very clear personal mission statement right there in his preface. He says he's not doing this for fame.
What was his goal then?
He says he doesn't care if his own name remains in darkness, as long as his work helps to preserve the memory of the deeds of the world's preeminent nation.
That is the language of a moral historian. He's not just recording events, he's building a monument.
He's building a moral foundation for the new age.
So how did that mission affect his view of historical accuracy? That's the million-dollar question.
It is. And the answer is complicated. He's writing hundreds, sometimes thousands of years after the events he's describing. He's relying on older, often contradictory sources.
So he's not an archivist in the modern sense.
Not at all. His commitment wasn't to dry, factual chronology. It was to moral instruction. He would choose the version of the story that was the most heroic, the most eloquent, or the one that taught the best lesson.
And his narrative was just so compelling that for many Romans, it became the truth. He created the definitive popular version of their history.
He absolutely did. He built the narrative framework of what it meant to be Roman duty, courage, devotion to the state. His work was less a history book and more a patriotic textbook.
We should also remember he wrote other things, too. He wasn't just a historian.
That's right. The great history overshadows everything, but we know he wrote philosophical dialogues, probably modeled on Cicero. He also wrote an essay as a letter to his son.
So he was deeply engaged in the philosophical debates of his time.
Yes, and Seneca the Younger gives us a great insight here. He said Livy's dialogues were so good they could be classified as history and philosophy. It just confirms that Livy saw his job as exploring these deep questions about human nature and society. History was just his main tool.
Okay, so let's pivot to something really unexpected. One of the strangest long-term influences of his work was on a scientific debate about the origins of the Etruscans.
This is one of my favorite examples of his influence. It shows how a single, almost throwaway line in his massive text could shape scholarship for centuries.
His book became the basis for the northern theory of where the Etruscans came from. How?
It's in a passage where he's talking about the Alpine tribes, a group called the Radi. And he just suggests, sort of as a side comment, that the Radi were undoubtedly of the same kind as the Etruscans.
So he's drawing a direct ancestral line between this sophisticated ancient civilization, the Etruscans, and these rough mountain tribes to the north.
He is. And he probably based it on some old local stories or maybe a linguistic similarity he'd heard about. But he adds this little caveat that makes the theory so powerful.
What's the caveat?
He notes that the Radi had become so primitive because of their remote location that they only retained a trace of their Etruscan origins in their language, and even that was corrupted.
Ah, so that explains the cultural difference while keeping the link.
Exactly. And when scholars in the Renaissance and later started digging into the mystery of Etruscan origins, which we still debate today, they seized on this single statement from Livy.
Because if Livy said it, it must have some weight.
Immense weight. Scholars like Carl Ottfried Miller used this line as the core evidence for a northern migration theory, that the Etruscans came down from the Alps. Livy's authority basically chopped up that entire school of thought for hundreds of years.
So we have this philosopher historian, this provincial patriot, writing this epic moral narrative, and now he lands in the most politically dangerous place imaginable, the court of the Emperor Augustus.
And this is where his skill really shines. His relationship with Augustus and the whole Julio-Claudian family was, well, exceptional. He was a genuine friend of the emperor.
And it was a friendship that worked both ways, presumably?
Oh, for sure. Livy got protection, he got access, and Augustus. He got the ultimate historical validation for his new regime.
You have to remember, Augustus had won the civil wars, but he needed legitimacy. He had to frame the empire not as a destruction of the republic, but as its righteous fulfillment.
And Livy's history delivered exactly that. It wasn't just a history, it was promotion. The sources are explicit that he wrote with embellished accounts of Roman heroism, specifically to promote the new Augustan government.
He made the transition from republic to empire seem righteous and inevitable.
It's historical legitimation at its finest. He basically takes the stern moral virtues of the early republic, the values of his hometown, Patavium, and argues that those values led directly to the peace and greatness of the Augustan age.
It's a brilliant move. He makes the new empire feel ancient and virtuous.
Masterful rhetorical politics.
But this brings us to that amazing contradiction, the thing that shows just how complex this friendship was, the Pompeianus paradox.
Yes, this is where it gets really, really interesting. How can you praise the virtues of the dead republic while being best friends with the man who killed it?
The answer comes from the historian Tacitus, writing a century later.
It does. Tacitus tells us this incredible anecdote, that Augustus himself had a nickname for Livy. He called him Pompeianus.
Let's just pause on that. Pompeianus, as in Pompey the Great.
Gnaeus Pompeius, Augustus's ultimate rival, the man he defeated in a brutal civil war to gain sole power.
And the emperor is calling his favorite historian Pompey's man. That is an astonishing level of confidence.
It's unbelievable. And the reason Augustus gave him that nickname was because Livy's history contains such a strong, powerful, panegyric, a formal praise for Pompey.
Which is the last thing you'd expect. You'd think he'd have to downplay Augustus's old enemies.
But he did the opposite. And if you think back to his identity, it makes perfect sense. His hometown, Patavium, was fiercely pro-Pompey. Livy was just staying true to his conservative Republican roots.
He was honoring a great defender of the traditional republic.
Even though he was on the losing side. And what's truly remarkable is what Tacitus says next. He confirms that this nickname was no obstacle to their friendship.
That's the aha moment. It shows that either Augustus was so secure in his power that he could afford to joke about it,
Or that Livy's skill and his overall value to the regime's narrative was so immense that a little praise for Pompey was a price worth paying.
It suggests this really nuanced, sophisticated relationship. Livy somehow manages to keep his reputation for eloquence and truthfulness, as Tacitus put it.
While writing the official history of the new regime, it's an incredible balancing act.
And his influence didn't stop there. He was actively mentoring the next generation of the imperial family.
Yes, the source confirms that Livy personally encouraged Augustus's grandnephew, the young boy who would one day become the Emperor Claudius, to start writing history.
So he wasn't just a chronicler of the past, he was shaping the intellectual future of the dynasty.
He was deeply embedded, the defining intellectual voice of the age, right at the center of power.
It's amazing to think that Livy wasn't just influential later on. He was a full-blown celebrity in his own lifetime.
A massive celebrity.
Yeah.
Which makes the fact that we lost so much of his work even more tragic.
Let's talk about his immediate reception. His history was in huge demand from the moment it came out.
The anecdotes about his fame are just incredible. Pliny the Younger tells this one story that really gives you a sense of it.
I think I know the one you mean.
He says Livy was so famous that a man traveled all the way from Cadiz, which is in modern Spain, the absolute edge of the known world,
Right.
all the way to Rome and back for the sole purpose of meeting him.
He didn't come to see the Senate or to trade. He came for a celebrity meet and greet with an author.
That's the ancient equivalent of a fan flying across the world just for a 5-minute chat with their favorite writer. It's incredible.
And because he was so famous, so accepted, his work became the source for basically every historian who came after him.
He set the canon. You see his influence everywhere, from writers who summarize Roman history like Florus and Eutropius to Christian chroniclers like Orosius, who were trying to make sense of Rome's pagan past.
Even in really specific niche works.
For sure. A writer named Julius Obsequens compiled this book called De Prodigiis, which was a list of all the supernatural events and omens in Roman history.
And where did he get his information?
He had to rely on Livy, or a source who had access to Livy. Livy's narrative was the recognized authority on everything that had ever happened, from battles to miracles.
But the very things that made it so popular, its fame and its enormous length, are what led to its loss in the Middle Ages. How did we lose over 100 books?
It was a problem of pure practicality. Urbe Condita was gigantic. Copying all 142 books by hand onto scrolls was incredibly expensive and time-consuming, and then you had to store them all.
It required a huge amount of library space, which was a rare commodity.
And a very rare commodity, especially during the more chaotic centuries of the Middle Ages. So what happened was, people started relying on summaries instead.
Epitomes.
Exactly. They were shorter, cheaper, and easier to copy and store. And once the summaries became popular enough, the incentive to copy the massive original work just disappeared.
The full manuscript stopped being copied, and the ones that existed were lost to time, to fires, to neglect.
And it became one of the greatest cultural losses of the ancient world.
So then you fast forward to the Renaissance, and scholars suddenly realize how much of Rome's story is just gone.
And it sparks this intense revival, a kind of historical treasure hunt. The recovery of lost classical texts was a central project of the Renaissance, and Livy was the top prize.
They were trying to find manuscripts hidden away in monastery libraries all over Europe.
A frantic, high-stakes search.
Huh.
And it commanded serious money. You told me about that incredible anecdote with the poet Beccadelli.
Oh, it's just amazing. The poet Antonio Beccadelli sold his country home, a massive asset, just to buy one copied manuscript of Livy.
He traded his house for a book. It just shows the insane cultural value they placed on his words.
And it wasn't just eccentric poets. Major figures were involved.
The great humanist Petrarch launched his own searches. Pope Nicholas V made it a papal mission to find the missing books. It was seen as a quest to recover the very soul of Rome.
And this recovery didn't just affect literature, it shaped political thought.
Hugely. Dante had praised Livy centuries before. Later, King Francis I of France commissioned all this art based on Livian themes of heroism and Roman virtue.
But the biggest influence on Western political thought has to be Niccolo Machiavelli.
Without a doubt. Machiavelli's most important work on governance, the Discourses on Livy, is literally a commentary on Livy's history.
He's using Livy's stories about the Roman Republic to build his own theories on how states work.
He's extracting these practical, sometimes ruthless lessons on modern statecraft directly from Livy's moralizing tales. It's a foundational text of political science.
And to wrap this up, there's that one last heartbreaking anecdote from Walter Scott.
It's just a stunning detail. Scott reports it as a true story from the 1715 Jacobite uprising in Scotland. A Scotsman involved in the rebellion gets captured, but then he managed to escape.
He's free. He got away clean. But he doesn't run.
He doesn't. He lingered near the place of his captivity. Why? Because he was hoping to get back his most prized possession, his favorite copy of Titus Livius.
And that hesitation got him recaptured.
And executed. He literally died for his love of a book written nearly 2,000 years earlier. It's an almost unbelievable testament to the power of Livy's writing. So we've established his huge influence, his celebrity, but now we have to deal with a fundamental problem that all classical scholars face.
Which is that for all his fame, we aren't even 100% certain about the basic dates of his life.
Exactly. The data is, let's say, a little bit shaky.
So where does our information for his birth and death even come from?
Primarily from one source, a summary of world history written by a bishop named Eusebius of Caesarea in the early 4th century AD. The work is called the Chronicon.
And the problem, as is so often the case, is that we don't have the original.
We don't. The original Greek is mostly lost. We rely almost entirely on translations and fragments, mainly St. Jerome's Latin translation.
So we're already dealing with copy, a translation.
A translation that was also supplemented with new material by Jerome. And this is where the problem of variation comes in.
What do you mean by that?
Well, when you look at the different surviving manuscripts of Jerome's Chronicon, which are copies of copies of copies, they often have different dates for the same events. The material isn't exactly the same.
And they were juggling different dating systems too, right?
Yes, which made errors almost inevitable. A scribe might be converting a date from the Roman Urbe Condita system to the Greek Olympiad system, or just noting a person's age. Any little miscalculation
Gets copied into the next version and becomes locked in as a fact in that manuscript tradition.
Precisely. Which means, as the sources say, there is no such date as a single, universally accepted standard date for Livy's life.
That's a really important thing for us to remember. So much of ancient history is about probability, not absolute certainty.
It is.
So if there's no certainty, what is the accepted scholarly consensus that we use today?
The working consensus is based on analyzing the Olympiad codes in the manuscripts. The codes 180.2 for his birth and 199.1 for his death are the ones most scholars rely on. And when you calculate those out, they correspond to a birth in 59 BC and a death in AD 17.
Which is the timeline we've been using.
It is. But we have to be honest and acknowledge that other manuscripts exist. For example, one gives a different code that would place his birth in 57 BC.
So there's always that little question mark.
Always. It's kind of a perfect metaphor, isn't it? The man who solidified Rome's legendary past has a personal timeline that is itself a fragile narrative pieced together from fragments centuries after he died. It's a reminder of how history itself works.
At the end of the day, the story of Titus Livius is just this incredible masterclass in influence and, frankly, political survival.
He lived this fascinating, contradictory life. The fiercely patriotic provincial who brings the moral virtues of his hometown right into the heart of the new imperial court.
He becomes the emperor's favorite historian, yet he's still championing the ethos of the republic that the emperor defeated.
And his history was so much more than a simple chronicle. It was a moral argument, carefully built to showcase Roman heroism and justify Augustus's new order by making it seem like the natural, virtuous endpoint of the republic.
And that central tension, the one we see in the Pompeianus paradox, that's his real legacy, isn't it?
I think so. His ability to praise the vanquished, to praise Pompey and still be close friends with the victor Augustus says everything about his rhetorical skill and his political genius.
His work ensured that the memory of the Republic's virtues, the very ideals Augustus had to crush to gain power, actually survived. They were preserved right there in the official history commissioned by the emperor himself.
Which leaves us with that critical question that Tacitus hinted at. What does it really take for a historian to maintain both eloquence and truthfulness while writing for the very power structure that destroyed the era he most admired?
That is the core tension. And it's a question that feels deeply relevant for us today. When we look at our own times of great political change, you have to wonder how the historical accounts being written right now, the journalism, the biographies, how will they be judged in 500 years?
Will future historians see our chroniclers as truth-tellers, or as clever Pompeiani, praising the old order while serving the new? Will the narrative they create about our present moment be seen as fact, or as a masterful justification for the powers that be?
Something to ponder as we think about the enduring power of history and the people who write it.